quiet, rural town nestled between vast fields and dense forests, life moved at a gentle pace. The townsfolk were hard-working and kind, their days filled with tending to crops and their nights spent sharing stories under the starlit sky. Among them lived a farmer named Thomas, a man of few words, but a heart full of compassion. Thomas was known not just for his skill in farming, but for his extraordinary bond with his dog, Buddy. Buddy was no ordinary dog. He had wandered into the town one stormy night, drenched and shivering, with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of the world. Thomas had found him hiding under the porch of his farmhouse, and without hesitation, he brought the dog inside, dried him off, and fed him. From that day on, Buddy became Thomas's shadow. The two were inseparable. Buddy would follow Thomas to the fields, help herd the cattle, and even sit by his side during meals, his tail thumping against the floor in contentment. Years passed, and Buddy grew older, but his loyalty never wavered. He was more than a pet. He was family. Thomas's wife, Margaret, often joked that Buddy loved Thomas more than she did. Their young son, Ethan, adored Buddy too, and the dog would playfully chase him around the yard, his barks echoing through the fields. But life, as it often does, took a cruel turn. One winter, Thomas fell ill. At first, it seemed like a common cold, but his condition worsened rapidly. The town doctor shook his head solemnly, saying there was little he could do. Margaret and Ethan were devastated, but Buddy refused to leave Thomas's side. He would lie by the bed, his head resting on Thomas's lap, as if his presence alone could heal his master. One evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Thomas called Buddy closer. His voice was weak, but his eyes were filled with love. "Buddy," he whispered, stroking the dog's head, "you've been my greatest friend. Promise me you'll take care of them." Buddy looked up at him, his eyes glistening, and let out a soft whine. Thomas smiled faintly and closed his eyes, his hand resting on Buddy's head. He never woke up. The loss was unbearable. Margaret and Ethan wept, their grief echoing through the empty house. But Buddy's sorrow was silent. He would sit by Thomas's grave for hours, his head bowed, as if waiting for his master to return. The townsfolk often saw him wandering the fields alone, his once bright eyes now clouded with sadness. Months passed, and life in the town moved on, but Buddy remained unchanged. He continued to guard the farm, herding the cattle, and watching over Margaret and Ethan. It was as if he had taken Thomas's last words to heart. He had made a promise, and he intended to keep it. One night, the town was shaken by the howls of wolves. A pack had descended from the forest, their eyes gleaming with hunger. The townsfolk barricaded their homes, but Margaret and Ethan, living on the outskirts, were vulnerable. Buddy, who had been lying by the fireplace, suddenly sprang to his feet. His ears twitched, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. He bolted out the door, disappearing into the darkness. The sounds that followed were terrifying. Snarls, yelps, and the clash of teeth. Margaret held Ethan close, praying for Buddy's safety. When dawn broke, the townsfolk ventured out and found Buddy lying in the snow, battered and bleeding, surrounded by the bodies of 3 wolves. He had fought with a ferocity that defied his gentle nature, protecting the family he had sworn to keep safe. Margaret rushed to Buddy's side, tears streaming down her face. "You brave, brave soul," she whispered, cradling his head in her lap. Buddy looked up at her, his tail giving a faint wag, as if to say, "I kept my promise." But the injuries were too severe. Buddy's breathing grew shallow, and his eyes began to close. Ethan knelt beside him, sobbing, "Please, Buddy, don't leave us too." Buddy licked the boy's hand one last time, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the first rays of the sun were breaking through the clouds. And then, with a final contented sigh, he was gone. The townsfolk buried Buddy beside Thomas, a testament to the bond that even death could not sever. Years passed, and the story of Buddy's sacrifice became legend. People would visit the graves, leaving flowers and whispering prayers, moved by the tale of a dog whose love knew no bounds. But the most poignant twist came one winter evening. Years later, Ethan, now a young man, was walking home when he saw a stray dog sitting by his father's grave. The dog looked up at him with familiar, soulful eyes, and Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It was as if Buddy had returned, his spirit unbroken, his promise eternal. And in that moment, Ethan understood. Love, loyalty, and promises are never truly lost. They live on in the hearts of those who remember, and sometimes in the eyes of a dog who refuses to let go.